In medieval Europe, a young woman's fate is sealed with a handful of silver coins, sold by her own father to a mysterious Viking warrior with cold gray eyes and a past written in scars. The iron collar around her neck marks her as his property, yet he refuses to touch her, treating her with a gentleness that confuses and haunts her more than cruelty ever could. But when Alina discovers the cross-shaped scar on her new husband's chest, the same symbol worn by the soldiers who slaughtered her village and killed her beloved brother, her world shatters. Is he protector or enemy, savior or destroyer? As royal decrees, forbidden truths, and ancient promises collide around them, one question burns hotter than all others. Why would a Viking prince buy a common girl as his bride, only to treat her with a respect no noble has ever shown? The answer will shatter everything she believed about love, loyalty, and the price of freedom, if she lives long enough to discover it. The distant thud of drums echoed through the mist-shrouded village, each beat like a nail hammered into Alina's heart. The 16-year-old girl stood trembling at the edge of the marketplace, her slender fingers clutching the frayed edges of her patched linen dress. Her eyes, once vibrant with dreams of a different life, now stared vacantly ahead, lost somewhere between raw fear and crushing shame. "Walk faster, girl," hissed the village elder, his bony fingers digging into her shoulder. The foreigner does not like to be kept waiting. Through the crowd of villagers, Alina caught sight of her father. Once a proud farmer, now a broken man with shoulders hunched beneath the weight of 3 failed harvests and a crippling debt. He stood with his head bowed, his calloused hands outstretched as they accepted a small leather pouch heavy with coins from the tall, broad-shouldered stranger. The metallic clink of silver seemed to echo across the square, drowning out even the persistent drumming. "She will be the Viking's wife," whispered a woman nearby, her voice a mixture of pity and relief that it was not her own daughter being traded away like cattle. "At least she won't starve this winter," replied another, as if that might comfort the girl who was being sold to a savage from the north. Alina tried to breathe, but the air felt like iron in her lungs, as if fate itself were strangling her. Her mother had died, bringing her younger sister into the world just 3 winters past. Now she was all her family had left to barter with. A single tear escaped down her cheek, quickly wiped away before anyone could witness her moment of weakness. The stranger, Bjorn, they called him, stood imposing in the center of the gathering. His gray eyes, cold as the northern seas, surveyed her without emotion. His beard was shorter than most Vikings, but his arms bore the intricate tattoos of a warrior who had seen battle and survived. He nodded once, satisfied with his purchase, and motioned toward the village elders' hall where the ceremony would take place. "Please," Alina whispered to her father as she passed him, a final desperate plea. "Don't do this." Her father couldn't meet her gaze. "I have no choice, daughter. We owe too much. It's this or death for us all." His voice cracked as he added, "He has promised to treat you well." Inside the elders' hall, the marriage was celebrated in weighted silence. No music played beyond the door, no mead flowed freely, no joyful oaths were exchanged, no loving kiss sealed the union. The room smelled of stale ale and wood smoke, the only witnesses a handful of elders and her broken father. Bjorn, the gray-eyed Viking, simply removed an iron collar from his satchel and placed it around Alina's neck. The metal was cold against her skin, a physical manifestation of her new reality. "With this, you are now free of debts," he said in a deep voice that carried an accent as sharp as winter frost. "But a prisoner of destiny." His Saxon was surprisingly good, each word deliberate and clear. Alina closed her eyes, her entire body tensed in anticipation of what would come next. The stories she'd heard about Viking men and their captured brides were enough to make her blood run cold. She braced herself for rough hands, for pain, for humiliation, but none came. When she dared to open her eyes again, she saw Bjorn had simply turned away. He unrolled a fur by the hearth, lay down upon it, and closed his eyes, his back to her. The elder's wife had prepared a small pallet for Alina on the opposite side of the room. Confusion mingled with relief as she carefully made her way to the bed. The coarse wool blanket scratched against her skin as she pulled it up to her chin, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was racing, trying to understand this strange man who had bought her but now showed no interest in claiming his purchase. In the dancing shadows cast by the dying fire, Elena wept silently. Tears for her lost freedom, for her family's desperation, for the uncertain future that stretched before her. But also, strangely, tears of puzzlement at the unexpected gentleness shown by a man she had been prepared to hate. The night passed slowly, each moment stretching into eternity. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by nightmares of iron collars tightening around her neck until she could no longer breathe. Each time she woke, she found Bjorn still sleeping on his furs, never having moved an inch closer to her. Dawn broke with the sound of an axe striking wood. Elena's eyes flew open, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings before the weight of the iron collar reminded her of everything. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill, and peered through the small window. Outside, Bjorn was already at work, his powerful arms swinging an axe in rhythmic strokes, splitting logs for the fire. His breath formed clouds in the cold morning air, and despite herself, Elena found herself watching the fluid movement of his muscles beneath his tunic. By the time she had washed her face in the basin of cold water and straightened her dress as best she could, Bjorn had entered with an armful of wood. Without a word, he stoked the fire and hung a small pot over the flames. From his pack, he produced dried meat, some herbs, and a handful of oats, which he added to the water. Still, there were no harsh commands, no rough hands, no cruel words, only a strange silence that seemed to speak volumes more than any explanation could. As the porridge began to bubble, Elena caught him watching her, not with lust or ownership, but with something far more complex, perhaps even regret. Their eyes met for the briefest moment before he looked away, focusing on stirring the breakfast with intense concentration. In that instant, Elena realized with startling clarity, her greatest fear was no longer what this man might do to her body, but rather what mysteries lay behind those stormy eyes. Understanding this stranger had suddenly become more terrifying than being owned by him. She took a tentative step forward, summoning courage she didn't know she possessed. "Thank you," she whispered, the first word she had spoken to him directly. "For not—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Bjorn nodded once, acknowledging her words without looking up. As he turned to retrieve wooden bowls from his pack, the collar of his tunic shifted slightly. Elena's breath caught in her throat. There, visible just above his collarbone, was a scar in the shape of a cross, the exact symbol carried by the army that had destroyed her village 3 summers ago. The same soldiers who had cut down her brother as he tried to protect their meager home. Blood drained from her face as past and present collided in a single devastating moment of recognition. Blood turned to ice in Elena's veins as she stared at the cross-shaped scar on Bjorn's chest. Her fingers instinctively moved to her throat, where the iron collar suddenly felt tighter, choking her with memories that came flooding back in violent waves. 3 summers ago. The screams, the flames licking at thatched roofs. Men bearing that same cross emblem had swept through her village like a storm of steel and fury. Her brother Aldrich, barely 17 winters old, had stood with nothing but a farming scythe against trained soldiers. She still remembered how his blood had pooled in the mud, how his eyes had stared emptily at the smoke-filled sky as their home burned behind him. And now that same mark was etched into the skin of the man who had purchased her. Bjorn turned, catching her horrified gaze. His gray eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of understanding crossing his weathered features. He set down the wooden bowls with deliberate care, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment between them. "Before you hate me," he said in that low, accented voice that seemed to rumble from deep within his chest, "hear my story." The words were not a command, but carried a weight of their own, firm yet tinged with an undercurrent of pain she had not expected. Elena's hand trembled as she reached for the bowl he offered. The porridge steamed in the cool morning air, the simple meal suddenly an impossible task to consume as her stomach knotted with conflicting emotions. Rage and curiosity warred within her, one demanding she scream accusations at this man who bore the mark of her brother's killers, the other desperately wanting to understand how he had come to wear both a Viking's tattoos and the scar of her enemies. Outside, the wind battered against the wooden shutters of the elders' hall, whistling through cracks and carrying with it the sounds of the village awakening. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the calls of women gathering at the well, all seemed strangely detached from the tense silence within these four walls. Bjorn ate without speaking, each spoonful measured and precise. There was something almost ritualistic in his movements, as if he carried the weight of countless burdens on his broad shoulders. He sat hunched slightly, a man divided, outwardly fierce with his warrior's build and scarred hands, yet inwardly wounded in ways Elena could not yet fathom. "That mark," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The cross on your chest." His spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Yes. The soldiers who bore it burned my village. They killed my brother." The words tumbled out before she could stop them, raw and jagged with grief still fresh after 3 long years. Bjorn set down his spoon and pushed the half-eaten bowl away. "I know." Those 2 simple words struck Elena like a physical blow. He knew? How could he know? Unless? Were you there? The question hung between them, heavy as a blade. No. He met her eyes directly for the first time, his gaze unflinching. "But I know of the raid. I know of many such raids." "Then how did you come to bear their mark? Why would a Viking carry the cross of Saxon soldiers?" Her voice grew stronger with each question, anger beginning to push through her fear. Bjorn's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, fingers tracing the outline of the scar beneath his tunic. "Not all marks are worn willingly," he said simply. "Some are carved into us against our will." The ambiguity of his answer only fueled Elena's confusion. She pushed away from the table, needing distance between herself and this enigmatic man who spoke in riddles while wearing the symbol of her nightmares upon his skin. Throughout the day, Bjorn busied himself with chores around the elder's property, chopping more firewood than could be used in a fortnight, mending a section of fence that had begun to rot, drawing water from the well. Elena watched him from windows and doorways, studying his movements as one might study a predator, trying to discern his true nature. By evening, dark clouds had gathered overhead, promising snow before morning. Inside, Bjorn prepared a simple stew with dried meat and root vegetables he had procured from somewhere in the village. The scent filled the small space, making Elena's stomach growl despite her misgivings. They ate in the same weighted silence that had characterized their breakfast. When the meal was finished, Bjorn produced a small whetstone and began methodically sharpening a hunting knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel oddly hypnotic in the firelit room. "Tomorrow we leave for my homestead," he stated without looking up from his task. "It is a 3-day journey north." Elena felt panic rising in her chest. Thus far, the familiar surroundings of her village had provided some small comfort, even as she occupied this strange new position as a purchased bride. The thought of traveling to unknown lands with this man, this bearer of enemy markings, was suddenly too much to bear. She waited until deep in the night, when Bjorn's breathing had settled into the steady rhythm of sleep. Moving with painstaking care, Elena gathered her thin cloak and a small bundle of food she had secreted away during the evening meal. The wooden door creaked slightly as she eased it open, wincing at each sound in the darkness. The night air bit at her cheeks as she slipped outside, snowflakes already beginning to fall in lazy spirals from the black sky. Freedom, or at least the illusion of it, beckoned beyond the village boundary. She took 3 hurried steps toward the tree line before a voice stopped her cold. "If you leave now, you will die frozen before dawn." Bjorn's voice emerged from the shadows beside the door where he had apparently been waiting, anticipating her escape. She had not heard him follow, had not detected any movement from his sleeping form. "The winter comes early this year," he continued, his breath visible in the cold air. "And you have neither provisions nor proper clothing for survival." Elena stood frozen, caught between flight and surrender, her meager bundle clutched to her chest. "But if you stay," there was a hesitation in his voice, almost vulnerability. "Perhaps you will discover the truth." "What truth?" she demanded, heart hammering wildly against her ribs. "That you bear the mark of those who slaughtered innocent villagers?" I've seen that truth already. You've seen a mark, he corrected quietly. Not the story behind it. Not why a Viking would pay good silver for a Saxon bride he does not touch. Not why I came to your village at all. His words hung in the frigid air between them, each one a puzzle piece that promised to form a picture she could not yet imagine. Elena hesitated, torn between the desperate urge to flee and the maddening need to understand. Snowflakes gathered on her eyelashes as she stood paralyzed by indecision. The rational part of her mind knew Bjorn spoke truth about the weather. To flee now, unprepared, would likely mean death in the unforgiving winter landscape, yet staying meant placing her trust in a man who carried the emblem of her greatest sorrow upon his very skin. One night, she finally whispered, "I will listen tomorrow, and then decide." Bjorn nodded once, stepping aside to allow her passage back into the relative warmth of the elder's hall. As she passed him, she caught a scent of pine and smoke, and something else, something almost like grief. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams haunted by burning villages and brothers who called her name as they fell. When gray dawn finally broke, Elena rose early, determined to face whatever revelations the day might bring. But as she bent to arrange her sleeping pallet, her eye caught a glint of metal beneath Bjorn's bed. Glancing to ensure he was still outside tending to the horses for their journey, she knelt and reached beneath the wooden frame. Her fingers closed around a small metal object, a medallion on a leather cord. As she drew it into the light, her heart nearly stopped beating altogether. There, etched into the tarnished surface, was a name she knew better than her own, Aldrich. Her dead brother's name, carved into a medallion now in the possession of the Viking who bore the scar of her brother's killers. Elena's heart nearly ceased its beating. The medallion lay heavy in her palm, the metal worn smooth around the edges from years of handling. Aldrich's name, carved in careful letters by their father's own hand as a name-day gift when he had turned 13, stared up at her like an accusation. Her fingers trembled as they traced the familiar inscription. This was no coincidence, no cruel trick of fate. This medallion had hung around her brother's neck every day since he had received it, including the day he had fallen defending their home. The leather cord was new, but the medallion itself, with its small chip in the corner where Aldrich had once dropped it on stone, was unmistakably her brother's. The room seemed to spin around her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as memories flooded back. Aldrich's laugh, his protective arm around her shoulders during storms, the way he had stood tall with only a farmer's tool against armored men. And then, the awful stillness of his body in the mud, the medallion glinting against his bloodied chest. How had this precious relic come to be in the possession of Bjorn? The creak of the door sent a jolt of panic through her. Elena's head snapped up, her fingers closing protectively around the medallion as Bjorn stepped into the room. Their eyes met in a moment of terrible understanding. He knew exactly what she had found. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. "Where did you get this?" she finally demanded, her voice raw with emotion, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She held the medallion up, the leather cord dangling between them like a challenge. "This belonged to my brother." Bjorn remained motionless in the doorway, his expression inscrutable. The morning light streaming through the open door cast half his face in shadow, making him appear both vulnerable and dangerous at once. A man divided. "Answer me!" The words tore from her throat, half command, half plea. "How did you come by my dead brother's medallion? Did you take it from his body after your men cut him down?" Bjorn closed the door behind him with deliberate care. He walked toward her with measured steps, each one seeming to echo in the small room. When he reached her, he did not grab for the medallion as she had expected. Instead, he gently took it from her trembling hands and placed it on the rough wooden table between them. "I did not kill your brother," he said, his voice low and steady. "I promised to protect him." A shadow passed over his face, the first crack in his stoic facade. "But I failed." Elena felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "You lie," she whispered, unable to reconcile his words with everything she believed she knew. "The men who bore that cross on their shields, they destroyed our village. They killed Aldrich, and you bear their mark." "Yes," he acknowledged, his hand moving unconsciously to his chest, where the cross-shaped scar lay hidden beneath his tunic. I bear their mark, but not by choice. Bjorn turned away from her then, moving to stare out the small window that overlooked the snow-dusted village. His broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "The men who attacked your village were not acting on orders from their king," he said after a long moment. "They were renegades led by a commander named Osric, men without honor who raided villages for their own gain, using the cross as false justification." Elena shook her head in disbelief. "And I should believe this? From a Viking who now wears their symbol?" "This was burned into my flesh," Bjorn replied, his voice hardening as he turned back to face her. "After I tried to stop them at another village. After I killed 3 of their men trying to save innocents." For the first time since she had met him, true emotion flickered across Bjorn's face. A flash of remembered pain and rage, so intense it momentarily transformed him. "I was captured, branded as a traitor to the cross." His words were clipped now, each one seeming to cost him something to speak aloud. "Then sold to slave traders from the north." "But you're a Viking," Elena protested, confusion battling with the anger that had sustained her for so long. "Half Viking," he corrected. "My mother was Saxon, my father a Norse trader. I was raised in both worlds, belonging fully to neither." Elena's mind reeled as she struggled to absorb these revelations. If what he said was true, if he had indeed tried to stop the men who had destroyed her village, then everything she had assumed about him was wrong. Yet one question remained unanswered. "My brother's medallion," she insisted, pointing to the table where it still lay. "How did it come to you?" Something in Bjorn's expression shifted, a shadow of grief passing over his features. For the first time since she had met him, he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I encountered your brother after your village was raided," he said quietly. "He was gravely wounded, but still alive when I found him. I tried to help him, to stop the bleeding." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. The thought of Aldrich's suffering, clinging to life after she had believed him instantly killed, was almost too much to bear. "He spoke of his sister," Bjorn continued, each word seeming to cost him. "He made me swear to find you if he didn't survive. To ensure you were safe." "But you didn't find me," Elena challenged, tears now streaming freely down her face. "Not for 3 years, and when you did, you bought me like cattle." Bjorn flinched at her words. "I was taken as a slave myself shortly after your brother died. It was 2 years before I won my freedom through combat. Another year before I could trace you to this village." His hands clenched at his sides. "When I arrived, I learned of your father's debt. The only way to ensure you would not be sold to someone worse was to pay that debt myself. So you purchased me out of obligation?" The question hung in the air between them, laden with implications neither was prepared to address. "Out of honor," Bjorn corrected, finally meeting her eyes again. "A promise made to a dying man." Elena turned away, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze. Her entire world had shifted in the space of minutes. The hatred she had nurtured for 3 years suddenly left without proper target. The man she had been prepared to despise now stood revealed as her brother's would-be savior. Unless it was all an elaborate lie. "You expect me to believe this tale?" she asked, her voice hardening as she fought to regain her emotional footing. "That you, a stranger, happened upon my dying brother and swore to protect his sister? That you then endured years of slavery, won your freedom, and tracked me across the country, all to fulfill a promise to a man you never knew?" "I do not expect you to believe anything," Bjorn replied evenly. "The truth requires no belief to remain truth." He stepped forward then, reaching for the medallion on the table. Elena tensed, but he merely lifted it and held it out to her, offering it on his open palm. "This belongs to your family," he said softly. "Take it." Elena hesitated, then slowly reached for the medallion. As her fingers closed around the cool metal, their hands briefly touched. The contact, so slight it could hardly be called a touch at all, sent an unexpected warmth through her fingertips. She quickly withdrew, clutching the precious memento to her chest. "This changes nothing," she said, though even to her own ears the words sounded uncertain. "I still don't know who you truly are." Bjorn nodded once, accepting her skepticism without argument. "We leave for the north within the hour." he said, his voice returning to its customary neutrality. "Pack what you wish to bring." He turned and left the room without another word, leaving Alina alone with her brother's medallion and a mind in turmoil. Hours later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered ground, Alina stood at the window watching Bjorn in the distance. He had walked to the edge of the village, where the forest began its march toward the northern mountains. There, kneeling in the fresh snow, his proud body was bent in what could only be described as supplication. His lips moved silently, forming words in his native tongue that she could not understand. But the posture was unmistakable. He was praying, asking forgiveness from his gods. The sight struck her with unexpected force. This warrior, this enigma of a man, kneeling alone in the snow, speaking to deities she did not know. Was he praying for Aldrich's soul, for guidance in keeping his promise, or for something else entirely? As she watched him, torn between lingering suspicion and budding doubt about her own certainties, movement at the edge of her vision caught her attention. A rider approached from the King's Road, his cloak bearing the unmistakable insignia of royal service. In his hand, visible even at this distance, was a rolled parchment sealed with wax, the kind used for official proclamations or warrants of arrest. The rider's gaze was fixed on Bjorn's kneeling figure, his expression grim with purpose. Alina felt her breath catch in her throat as understanding dawned. This was no coincidental visit to a remote village. The rider had come for Bjorn. The royal messenger dismounted with practiced efficiency, his movements sharp and authoritative. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he straightened to his full height, shaking the accumulated snowflakes from his deep blue cloak. The royal insignia, a golden hawk clutching a sword, gleamed against the rich fabric despite the overcast day. Alina felt the ground beneath her feet seem to fall away. Her fingers clutched the windowsill for support as her mind raced. In all her years, she had never seen a royal messenger visit their humble village. Such men carried the king's word, his judgment, his law, and they rarely brought good tidings to common folk. The messenger's voice rang out across the snow-covered clearing, carried on the winter wind to where Bjorn still knelt in prayer. By order of King Harald, the warrior known as Bjorn Halfdan's son is to be brought before the royal court, alive, the messenger proclaimed, his voice cutting through the stillness of the afternoon. After a calculated pause, he added with ominous finality, "or dead." Alina's breath crystallized before her in the cold air of the room. The royal decree confirmed her worst fears. Bjorn was indeed someone of consequence, someone important enough to warrant a king's attention. But was he a criminal, a traitor? Everything he had told her about helping her brother, about opposing the raiders who had destroyed her village, had it all been cleverly crafted lies? Through the window, she watched as Bjorn slowly rose to his feet, brushing snow from his knees with deliberate calm. His face betrayed no surprise at the messenger's appearance, as though he had long been expecting such a summons. This realization sent a chill through Alina that had nothing to do with the winter air. Indecision paralyzed her for a precious moment. If Bjorn was truly an enemy of the king, harboring him, even unwittingly, could mark her as complicit in his crimes. Yet if his story about trying to save her brother held any truth, before she could fully consider her options, her feet were already moving, carrying her through the door and into the biting cold outside. Snow immediately soaked through her thin shoes as she hurried toward the confrontation unfolding at the village edge. "What crimes does this man stand accused of?" she called out as she approached, her voice steadier than she felt. Both men turned toward her, the messenger with irritation, Bjorn with something that might have been concern. "This is not your affair, woman," the messenger replied dismissively, his hand moving to rest meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. "The king's business is for the king's men." "She has a right to know," Bjorn interjected, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "She is my wife." The words, spoken so matter-of-factly, sent an unexpected flutter through Elena's chest. It was the first time he had claimed her as such, though the iron collar around her neck was proof enough of their arrangement. The messenger's lip curled slightly. "Then she has married a traitor and oathbreaker," he declared, unrolling the parchment with a flourish. "Bjorn Halfdan's son stands accused of treason against the crown, desertion from royal service, and conspiracy with enemies of the realm. Elena's gaze darted to Bjorn's face, searching for confirmation or denial. His expression remained impassive, though something flickered in the depths of his gray eyes. A shadow of old pain, perhaps, or resignation. These charges come directly from Lord Osric, commander of the king's eastern garrison. The messenger continued, seemingly pleased with the reaction his words had provoked. At the mention of Osric's name, Bjorn's composure finally cracked. A muscle tightened in his jaw, and his hands clenched at his sides. Osric, he repeated, the name emerging as little more than a growl. Of course it would be him. The messenger's hand tightened on his sword. You will come with me now to answer these charges before the king. For a tense moment, no one moved. The village had fallen eerily silent, as though holding its collective breath. Even the wind seemed to pause in its endless journey across the snow-covered landscape. Elena's mind raced. Osric, the same name Bjorn had mentioned earlier as the leader of the renegade soldiers who had destroyed her village. If this commander was now bringing charges against Bjorn, perhaps there was truth to his story after all. Perhaps he had indeed opposed the very men who had killed her brother. Her hesitation lasted only seconds. With a decisiveness that surprised even herself, Elena stepped toward the elder's hall. Please come inside before we all freeze. Surely you would not force a royal messenger to conduct the king's business in such bitter cold. The messenger paused, clearly weighing his options. The offer of warmth after a long ride through winter weather proved too tempting to resist. With a curt nod, he followed her toward the building, one hand still resting on his weapon as he kept Bjorn in his peripheral vision. Inside, the elder's hall felt stuffy after the sharp clarity of the winter air. The fire had burned low in their absence, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Elena busied herself adding logs to the flames, her mind working furiously to formulate a plan. The messenger moved to position himself between Bjorn and the door, clearly anticipating resistance. I will require lodging for the night, he announced, and we depart at first light. His tone left no room for negotiation. Bjorn stood perfectly still near the central hearth, his face illuminated by the growing flames. And if I refuse to go willingly? He asked, his voice deceptively calm. The messenger's smile was cold. Then I signal the men I have waiting in the forest, and we take you in chains, after putting this village to the torch for harboring a traitor. Elena's blood ran cold at the casual threat of violence against innocent villagers. It was all too reminiscent of what had happened to her own home 3 years before. History threatening to repeat itself in an endless cycle of cruelty. As the fire crackled and spat between them, the messenger pulled the parchment from his tunic once more, unrolling it with practiced efficiency. This warrant bears the king's own seal, he declared, holding it toward the flames for better illumination. To defy it is to defy the crown itself. In that moment, as the firelight caught the edges of the parchment, Elena made her decision. Without allowing herself to consider the consequences, she lunged forward as if stumbling on the uneven floor. Her shoulder collided with the messenger's outstretched arm, sending the royal document tumbling directly into the heart of the fire. "You clumsy fool!" the messenger roared, diving toward the flames in a desperate attempt to retrieve the parchment. But it was too late. The dry paper had already begun to curl and blacken, the king's red wax seal melting into oblivion. The smell of burning parchment filled the room as the messenger rounded on Elena, his face contorted with rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed, grabbing her arm with bruising force. "Destroying a royal decree is treason." Before he could say more, Bjorn was between them, his hand closing around the messenger's wrist with careful but unmistakable strength. "Release her," he said quietly. "It was an accident." The messenger yanked his arm free, his eyes darting between them with dawning suspicion. "This changes nothing," he spat. "I know my orders, with or without the document. And now you both stand accused of crimes against the crown." His hand moved to his sword, drawing it with a metallic hiss that seemed to slice through the tension-filled air. "Perhaps I should dispense the king's justice here and now." What happened next unfolded with bewildering speed. The messenger lunged, his blade arcing toward Bjorn's chest. Bjorn sidestepped with the practiced grace of a seasoned warrior, catching the man's sword arm and redirecting his momentum toward the hearth. The messenger stumbled, his free hand grabbing desperately for purchase and finding only the hanging pot above the fire. Metal crashed against stone as pot and man tumbled into the flames. Sparks erupted in a brilliant shower, casting wild, dancing shadows across the walls. The scent of burning wood mingled with the acrid smell of singed fabric and something worse, burning flesh. The messenger howled, scrambling away from the collapsed hearth, beating frantically at the embers that clung to his cloak. Bjorn seized the moment, delivering a precise blow to the man's temple that sent him crumpling to the floor, unconscious but alive. For several heartbeats, the only sounds were the crackling of the disturbed fire and their own ragged breathing. The air smelled of smoke and fear, a scent Alina knew all too well from the day her village had burned. Bjorn turned to her, his expression grave. "He will bring others when he wakes. Many others." "I know," she whispered, the reality of what she had done beginning to settle over her like a shroud. By destroying the king's decree, she had aligned herself with Bjorn against the crown. There would be no explaining it away as an accident, no mercy for either of them now. I couldn't let him take you. Not before I know the truth about Aldrich." Something shifted in Bjorn's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a deeper emotion she couldn't name. He nodded once, acknowledging the significance of her choice. "We must leave immediately," he said, already moving to gather his few possessions, "before he regains consciousness or his men come looking for him." As Alina hurriedly collected what little she owned, her mind whirled with the implications of her impulsive act. In a single moment, she had transformed from a debt-bound bride to a fugitive from royal justice. And for what? For a man she barely knew, whose story she couldn't fully verify, whose true identity remained shrouded in mystery. Yet something in her heart told her she had made the right choice, the only choice her brother would have wanted her to make. When she emerged from the Elder's Hall minutes later, Bjorn was waiting with 2 horses, his own sturdy northern breed and a smaller mare borrowed, or stolen, from somewhere in the village. The snow had begun to fall more heavily, a blessing that would help cover their tracks. Bjorn turned to her, offering his hand to help her mount. For the first time since she had met him, his lips curved into something resembling a smile. "Now," he said softly, "our destinies are truly linked." Alina took his hand, allowing him to lift her onto the mare's back. As they rode away from the village, snow swirling around them like a protective veil, she couldn't help but wonder what new dangers awaited them beyond the horizon. But one thing had become startlingly clear. Her fate and Bjorn's were now bound together by something stronger than an iron collar or a hastily performed marriage ceremony. They were bound by a shared secret, a common enemy, and the fragile beginnings of trust. As they crested the hill overlooking the village, a shadow moved across their path. A figure stood in the road ahead, wrapped in furs trimmed with what could only be royal ermine. A woman's figure, regal and commanding despite her small stature. The hood of her cloak fell back, revealing a face of striking beauty, framed by hair the color of raven's wings. Her eyes fixed on Bjorn with the intensity of one who knew him well, perhaps too well. Alina felt her heart constrict with an emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. "Bjorn?" The woman's voice flowed like honey poured over ice, sweet yet chilling, as she pronounced his name with an intimacy that made Alina instinctively tighten her grip on the mare's reins. The stranger's face was hauntingly beautiful, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale blue and unforgiving. Alina felt herself drawing back, a sudden hollow sensation spreading through her chest. Compared to this woman's regal bearing and flawless complexion, she was acutely aware of her own rough hands, her simple homespun dress, her hair tangled from their hasty departure. The iron collar around her neck seemed to grow heavier, a physical reminder of the vast difference in their stations. "I did not think you would hide yourself away with a peasant girl," the woman continued, her gaze flicking dismissively over Alina before returning to Bjorn. A slight smile played at the corners of her perfect lips, but it failed to reach her eyes. Those remained cold, calculating, measuring each reaction with predatory precision. Bjorn sat motionless upon his horse, his expression unreadable. Only the slight tension in his shoulders betrayed any emotion at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. "Freya, I did not expect to see you so far from court." The woman, Freya, stepped forward, her movements fluid and graceful despite the thick snow underfoot. Her fur-trimmed cloak parted slightly, revealing a dress of deep crimson wool embroidered with gold thread. Around her neck hung a pendant set with jewels that caught the fading afternoon light, sparkling like captured stars against the darkness of her attire. "The court goes where I command it to go," she replied with casual arrogance. "And it seems I arrived just in time." Her gaze shifted meaningfully to the village below, where movement could be seen around the elders' hall. The messenger had awakened. "Your situation grows more complicated by the moment. What do you want, Freya?" Bjorn's question was direct, his patience clearly wearing thin. Freya's laugh was like the tinkling of small bells, beautiful yet somehow hollow. "Is that any way to address your betrothed? After all this time apart?" The word struck Alina like a physical blow. Betrothed. This woman was to be Bjorn's wife. His true wife, not a purchased debt bride, but a high-born lady worthy of his station, whatever that station truly was. "Former betrothed," Bjorn corrected firmly. "Those arrangements ended 3 years ago." "Did they?" Freya raised one perfect eyebrow, the gesture somehow both elegant and threatening. "My father does not seem to think so, nor does the court. Your disappearance was viewed as a temporary madness, a warrior's restlessness before settling into the responsibilities of marriage." As they spoke, Alina pieced together the fragments of revelation. This woman was clearly of noble birth, perhaps even royal, given her bearing and the quality of her attire. And if she was Bjorn's betrothed, then he must be of similar standing. Not the simple warrior he had presented himself to be, but someone of significant rank and importance. "I made my position clear before I left," Bjorn replied, his tone hardening. "I will not be a pawn in your father's political games. And yet here you are, playing games of your own." Freya's gaze returned to Alina, this time with greater interest. "Purchasing a village girl as your bride? I must say I'm almost impressed by the audacity, though I wonder if she knows who you truly are." The question hung in the air between them, laden with implication. Alina fought to keep her expression neutral, unwilling to give this beautiful, dangerous woman the satisfaction of seeing her confusion. Freya took another step forward, close enough now that Alina could smell the exotic perfume that clung to her, something foreign and expensive like crushed flowers from distant lands. "Has he told you who he is, little peasant? What blood runs in his veins? Leave her out of this," Bjorn warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "Your quarrel is with me alone." "Oh, but she's very much in this now, isn't she?" Freya countered, her smile widening to reveal perfect teeth. "Especially after that little display with the royal messenger. Destroying the king's decree? That's treason, punishable by death." She clicked her tongue in mock disapproval. "My father is not known for his mercy toward traitors." The pieces suddenly aligned in Alina's mind with sickening clarity. "Your father is the king," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Freya turned to her, appearing almost delighted by her realization. "Princess Freya, daughter of King Harald, at your service." She offered a mocking curtsy. "And you must be the debt bride I've heard whispers about." The girl Bjorn purchased to avoid his royal obligations. Bjorn moved his horse slightly, positioning himself between the two women. "Enough, Freya. What do you want?" The princess straightened, all pretense of amusement vanishing from her face. "What I've always wanted, Bjorn. You returned to court, fulfilling the alliance our marriage was meant to seal." Her voice hardened. "Your little adventure in independence has gone on long enough. It's time you remembered your duties as the king's nephew and heir to the northern territories." The revelation struck Alina with the force of a physical blow. Bjorn was the king's nephew, a prince in all but name. The man she had believed to be a simple warrior, perhaps even a mercenary, was royal blood. The implications were staggering. "And what of Osric's charges against me?" Bjorn challenged. "Am I to return to face execution for treason?" Freya waved a dismissive hand. Easily managed. My father values the Northern Alliance far more than the complaints of an ambitious garrison commander. The charges will vanish, provided you return willingly. Her gaze sharpened. And alone. The implication was clear. Alina was not welcome in this arrangement. She was an inconvenience to be discarded, a complication to be removed from the equation. And if I refuse? Bjorn's question hung in the cold air between them. Freya's smile returned, cold and calculating. Then the full weight of the king's justice falls not only on you but on her as well. She nodded toward Alina. The messenger's men are already searching. By nightfall, every village within 20 miles will be looking for you both. There is no escape. Alina felt her world narrowing, possibilities collapsing around her like a house of cards. Whatever fragile trust had begun to form between her and Bjorn now seemed built on foundations of sand. He had never told her of his royal blood, of his betrothal to a princess. What else had he concealed? There is always a choice, Bjorn replied, his voice steady despite the dire circumstances. Indeed. Freya nodded, her expression softening into something almost resembling kindness, though the calculation behind her eyes never wavered. And I'm offering you the only sensible one. Return with me to court, fulfill your obligations as the king's nephew, and I will personally ensure this girl is pardoned for her crime against the crown. She paused, letting the offer sink in. She can return to her village, debt-free, with enough silver to ensure she never goes hungry again. A generous settlement for a marriage that was never meant to be. The proposal hung between them, tempting in its simplicity. Alina would be free, truly free, not just traded from one owner to another. And Bjorn would return to the life he had been born to, the position his blood demanded. Alina found herself unable to look at him, fear gripping her heart that she might see relief in his eyes at the chance to be rid of his unwanted bride. The collar around her neck felt suddenly like it was choking her. Come, Bjorn, Freya continued, her voice dropping to a gentle murmur. You know this is the only way. Your northern rebellion was admirable, but it's time to return to reality, to who you truly are. And who am I, Freya? He asked quietly. The obedient nephew? The convenient political alliance? The tamed wolf to be paraded at court? You are the heir to the northern territories, she replied without hesitation. A warrior prince whose marriage will unite two powerful bloodlines and bring peace to lands that have seen too much warfare. That is your destiny, Bjorn. Not playing house with a village girl you purchased out of some misguided sense of honor or rebellion. The princess turned her attention to Alina then, her expression shifting to one of practiced sympathy. Did he tell you why he really bought you, girl? Did he explain that you were never meant to be a true wife to him? That you were merely his punishment to himself, his way of rejecting the future that awaits him? Alina felt as though she had been struck. The words burrowed deep, finding purchase in her deepest insecurities. Was that true? Had she been nothing more than a symbol of Bjorn's rebellion against his royal duties? Not even a person, but a statement, the ultimate rejection of his arranged marriage to a princess? He never wanted you. Freya continued, her voice honey-sweet with poisonous truth. You were just his punishment. Alina couldn't bear to look at Bjorn, couldn't bear to see confirmation of the princess's words in his eyes. Instead, she stared at her hands clutching the reins, knuckles white with tension, as the last fragile threads of whatever had been building between them seemed to unravel in the cold winter air. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant shouts from the village below as the search for them intensified. Time was running out. A decision had to be made. What will it be, Bjorn? Freya asked, confidence radiating from her perfect features. Will you continue this futile resistance, dragging an innocent girl to her death? Or will you accept your birthright and give her the freedom she deserves? Bjorn remained silent, his face an unreadable mask as the fate of all three hung in the balance. The crackle of the small fire was the only sound that dared to break the oppressive silence. Alina sat on a fallen log, her body physically present, but her mind adrift in a storm of emotions. Night had fallen hours ago, bringing with it a bitter cold that seemed to seep directly into her bones. Or perhaps the chill came from within, from the hollow space that had opened in her chest since Princess Freya's revelations. They had managed to slip away during the confusion, neither accepting nor rejecting the princess's offer outright. Bjorn had asked for time to consider, one night to make his decision. Surprisingly, Freya had granted this small mercy, perhaps confident in her ultimate victory. They had ridden hard through forest paths known only to Bjorn, eventually making camp in a small clearing far from traveled roads. Now the dancing shadows cast by the flames painted grotesque figures across the snow-dusted ground, mimicking the twisted thoughts that tumbled through Elena's mind. The man who sat across from her, this stranger she had been bound to, was not who she had believed him to be. Not a simple warrior with a mysterious past, but royal blood. A prince in all but name, temporarily escaped from a life of privilege and power. And she had been nothing more than his rebellion, his statement against the future that awaited him. Not a person but a symbol, the most dramatic rejection of his royal betrothal he could manage. Bjorn remained silent, his face unreadable in the flickering firelight. He had spoken little since their encounter with Freya, offering only practical instructions as they made their escape. Now he sat sharpening his blade with methodical precision, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Go with her," Elena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow filling the clearing. The words felt like shards of glass in her throat, each syllable cutting as it emerged. Tears threatened to spill, but she fought them back, refusing to add shame to her already overwhelming sense of betrayal. "I don't want to be your burden anymore." The sharpening stone paused mid-stroke. Bjorn's eyes lifted slowly to meet hers across the flames, their gray depths unreadable. "Is that what you believe you are? A burden? What else would I be?" The question escaped before she could temper it with diplomacy. A peasant girl purchased to spite a princess. A debt bride taken to avoid a royal marriage. The bitterness in her voice surprised even herself. "Freya spoke the truth, didn't she? I was never meant to be your wife in anything but name. I was just punishment, your rebellion against who you truly are." Bjorn set his blade aside, the firelight casting half his face in shadow, the other half illuminated in harsh relief. For a long moment, he said nothing, his silence neither confirmation nor denial. "My royal blood is not who I truly am," he finally replied, each word measured and precise. "It is merely the accident of my birth, just as your status as a villager's daughter is not the sum of who you are. Yet it defines us all the same," Elena countered, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "It determined that you could purchase me with silver, that I could be traded to settle a debt. That Princess Freya believes she has more right to you than—" She stopped herself abruptly, unwilling to finish a thought that revealed too much of her heart. "Than you do?" Bjorn completed the sentence, his gaze intensifying. Elena looked away, focusing on the dancing flames rather than meet his eyes. "That's not what I meant to say. But it is what you feel." It wasn't a question, but a statement, spoken with quiet certainty. The tears she had been fighting finally spilled over, tracing hot paths down her cold cheeks. "What I feel doesn't matter," she whispered. "It never has. Not to my father when he sold me. Not to you when you bought me. And certainly not to your princess or your king." In one fluid motion, Bjorn rose and circled the fire, coming to kneel before her. Yet he did not touch her, maintaining a careful distance that somehow made his presence all the more powerful. "I never told you of my royal connections because that life is one I rejected long ago," he said, his voice low but intense. "The nephew raised to be a political pawn. The warrior trained only to fight his uncle's wars. The man promised since childhood to a woman he could never love. And yet it is the life that awaits you," Elena replied, finally meeting his gaze. "The life you were born to. We are not bound by the circumstances of our birth," Bjorn countered. "Or at least we shouldn't be." "Easy words from a prince who chose to live as a commoner," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Some of us have never had such choices." Bjorn's expression shifted then, something like pain flickering across his features before vanishing behind his customary stoicism. He rose and returned to his place across the fire, the distance between them suddenly seeming vast and unbridgeable. That night, Elena slept fitfully, wrapped in furs Bjorn had provided, but finding little warmth in them. Her dreams were fragmented visions of iron collars and royal crowns, of village fires and castle halls. When dawn finally broke, she woke to find Bjorn already alert, his possessions packed, his expression grimly determined. "I've made my decision," he said simply. Before Elena could respond, the sound of approaching horses filled the clearing. Her heart leapt to her throat as she scrambled to her feet, certain they had been discovered. But Bjorn showed no alarm, no surprise. He had been expecting this. Princess Freya rode into the clearing, accompanied by 4 royal guards. Her face bore the satisfied smile of one who knew her victory was assured. "I see you've come to your senses," she said to Bjorn, not bothering to acknowledge Elena's presence at all. "A wise choice, cousin. The Northern Alliance needs you." Bjorn nodded once, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "The girl goes free," he stated, not a request, but a command. "With a full pardon and the silver as promised." "Of course," Freya agreed smoothly. "I am nothing if not generous to those who know their place." Her gaze finally slid to Elena, cold and assessing. "You should consider yourself fortunate, peasant. Few of your station ever receive such compensation." Elena felt as though she were watching the scene from outside her own body. This was it then. Bjorn had made his choice, the only rational choice, the only one that offered them both a future. He would return to his royal duties, to the betrothal arranged since childhood, and she would return to what? A village that had sold her once and might do so again? "You'll be given a horse and escort to wherever you wish to go," Freya continued, her tone making it clear this discussion was beneath her station. "The pardon will be delivered within a fortnight. Until then, I suggest you remain inconspicuous." One of the guards dismounted, leading a spare horse forward. The animal was plain but sturdy, more than Elena had ever owned or expected to own. Attached to the saddle was a small pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of silver coins. This was her payment, the price of walking away from a marriage that had never truly existed. The compensation for her wounded pride and broken heart? Freedom purchased with royal silver and royal mercy. Elena raised her eyes to Bjorn's face, searching for something. Some indication that their brief time together had meant anything at all. Some sign that he regretted this parting. But his expression remained impassive, the mask of the warrior firmly in place. "Farewell, Elena," he said formally, the words weighted with finality. "May your future bring you peace." And that was all. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of the unspoken things that had grown between them during their short time together. Just a formal farewell, as one might offer to a passing acquaintance. Elena mounted the offered horse with as much dignity as she could muster, refusing to let her hands tremble where they could see. She would not give them, any of them, the satisfaction of witnessing her pain. "Goodbye, Bjorn," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I hope your royal duties bring you the fulfillment you seek." With that, she turned the horse and rode away without looking back, her spine straight, her head held high despite the iron collar that still encircled her neck, a reminder of all she had been and all she would never be. For 3 days she traveled southward, keeping to lesser-known paths, avoiding villages and royal roads alike. The silver in the pouch would be enough to start a new life somewhere, perhaps in one of the coastal towns where her origins would matter less than her willingness to work. The royal pardon, if it truly came, would ensure she could live without constantly looking over her shoulder. It should have felt like victory, like liberation. Instead, it felt like exile. On the 4th day, as she made camp beside a small stream, movement in the forest caught her attention. Soldiers, not just any soldiers, but those bearing the insignia of the royal garrison. Her heart seized with fear. Had the promise of pardon been just another royal lie? She barely had time to gather her meager possessions before they surrounded her, weapons drawn. "By order of King Harold," the captain announced, his voice devoid of emotion, "you are under arrest for treason against the crown." "There's been a mistake," Elena protested, panic rising in her chest. Princess Freya granted me pardon. I was given safe passage. The captain's laugh was harsh. Princess Freya's authority extends only so far as the king allows, and his orders supersede hers. His eyes narrowed. The Viking turned himself in, confessed to everything, said you were merely following his commands out of fear. Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Bjorn had attempted to protect her, to take full blame upon himself. But it seemed even a prince's sacrifice was not enough to counter a king's decree. As they bound her wrists with rough rope, one thought crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. Bjorn had known. He had known the pardon would never come, that Freya's promises were empty. He had gone with the princess not out of duty or ambition, but to buy Elena time to escape, time she had wasted traveling slowly, mourning a loss that wasn't what it seemed. The days that followed passed in a blur of cold stone walls and colder stairs. The dungeon beneath the king's fortress was a place where hope came to die, where time lost all meaning in the perpetual twilight of guttering torches and damp shadows. Elena sat with her back against the rough wall, eyes closed, conserving what little strength remained in her starved body. She had lost count of the days. Perhaps a week had passed, perhaps more. Food came irregularly, water even less so. Her once defiant spirit had been worn down by isolation and uncertainty. When footsteps approached her cell, she didn't bother to open her eyes. Another guard come to leer, perhaps. Or worse, an interrogator seeking confessions to crimes she hadn't committed. But then came the familiar sound of a key in the lock, the creak of rusted hinges, and footsteps too heavy to belong to the usual prison guards. Something in their deliberate pace, their measured tread, stirred a memory. Elena's eyes flew open, her heart suddenly racing despite her weakened state. There, in the dimly lit doorway, stood Bjorn, his tall frame silhouetted against the torchlight from the corridor. His face bore fresh bruises, and iron shackles bound his wrists before him. His proud shoulders were bowed but not broken, his gray eyes finding hers instantly in the gloom. "They lied to you," he said simply, his voice rough from disuse or perhaps from shouting. "I came to die by your side." The cell door clanged shut behind Bjorn, the sound reverberating through the stone chamber like a death knell. In the dim light cast by a single torch mounted outside their cell, Elena could see him more clearly now. The proud warrior prince reduced to a prisoner in his uncle's dungeon. His face bore the marks of brutal interrogation, a split lip that had only partially healed, a dark bruise blooming across his left cheekbone, dried blood crusted at his temple. Despite his injuries, despite the chains that bound his wrists, he still carried himself with an innate dignity that spoke of his true lineage. Royal blood, it seemed, revealed itself even in the darkest of circumstances. "Why are you here?" Elena asked, her voice cracked and thin from days of disuse. "Why didn't you stay with her, with the princess? You could have had everything." Bjorn moved carefully across the damp stone floor to sit beside her, his back against the same wall, their shoulders almost but not quite touching. The familiar smell of him, pine and leather and something uniquely his own, filled her senses, stirring memories of their brief time together. "Everything?" he repeated, a bitter smile tugging at his injured lip. "A gilded cage is still a cage, Elena, and some prices are too high, even for a crown." "But they will kill you now," she whispered, the reality of their situation settling over her like a shroud. "The king's nephew or not, they will execute you for treason, and me as well. Perhaps." He did not deny the truth of her words. "But I would rather die as the man I choose to be than live as the man they demand." A heavy silence fell between them, filled only with the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness and the occasional scurry of rats along the corridor outside. Elena studied his profile in the flickering light, the strong line of his jaw, the proud set of his shoulders even now. A prince indeed, though unlike any she had imagined in childhood tales. "There are things you need to know," Bjorn said finally, his voice low but clear in the stillness of their prison. "Truths I should have shared before now, before it's too late." "The truth about what?" Elena asked, though part of her already knew, had always known, that Bjorn carried secrets deeper than his royal bloodline. He shifted slightly, the chains at his wrists clinking softly as he turned to face her more directly. The truth about who I am, about why I left the court, about why I came to your village and why I truly made you my wife. Elena's heart quickened despite herself. After all they had endured, after all the lies and half-truths, here at the end he would finally offer her honesty. It was a gift more precious than silver or freedom, a gift she had not expected to receive before death claimed them both. "I am Bjorn Halfdan's son," he began, his voice taking on a rhythmic quality like the bards who recited ancient sagas around winter fires. "Born of a Saxon mother and a Norse father, raised between two worlds but belonging fully to neither. My father was the king's most trusted advisor and the ruler of the northern territories in all but name. When he died in battle 12 winters past, I became my uncle's ward." He paused, his gaze distant as though seeing not the cell walls, but the memories that had shaped him. "The king, my mother's brother, raised me alongside his daughter Freya. We were trained together, educated together, groomed to unite the northern and southern realms through marriage when we came of age." "A political alliance," Elena murmured, understanding dawning. "The oldest kind," Bjorn confirmed with a nod. "I was to be the bridge between Saxon and Norse, the half-blood prince who could command loyalty from both. My uncle saw not a nephew, but a tool to secure his legacy." His hands clenched, the chains rattling softly. "I might have accepted that fate had I not discovered the truth about the raids on the eastern villages, your village among them." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Here it was, the connection she had sensed from the beginning, the thread that had bound their fates together long before they had ever met. 3 years ago, I was leading a border patrol when we received reports of renegade soldiers attacking Saxon settlements," Bjorn continued. "Not Vikings as many believed, but the king's own men led by Commander Osric, the same man who now brings charges against me." "But why?" Elena asked, struggling to understand. "Why would the king's soldiers attack their own people?" Bjorn's expression darkened. "Because those villages refused to pay special tributes demanded by Osric, tributes that never reached the royal treasury. When I brought evidence of his corruption to my uncle, I expected justice. Instead, I found complicity. The implications were staggering." "The king knew," Elena whispered, horror dawning. "He allowed his commander to terrorize innocent villages for personal gain." "Worse," Bjorn said, his voice dropping even lower. "He sanctioned it. The raids served two purposes. They filled Osric's coffers and they created fear that only the crown could protect against. Villages that resisted were made examples of." "Like mine," Elena said, bile rising in her throat as she thought of her brother, of their burning home, of all the senseless destruction wrought in the name of greed and power. Bjorn nodded grimly. "When I threatened to expose this corruption to the northern chieftains, I became a liability. The king gave me a choice: marry Freya immediately and remain silent, or be branded a traitor and executed." "So you fled," Elena concluded, the pieces finally falling into place. "I fled," he confirmed, "but not before Osric's men captured me, branded me with their cross as punishment for my interference, and sold me to Norse slave traders. It took me 2 years to win my freedom through combat in the northern territories." His hand unconsciously moved to his chest where the cross-shaped scar lay hidden beneath his tunic. The mark she had once believed identified him as her enemy, now revealed as a badge of his resistance against true evil. "When I was finally free, I made my way back with one purpose: to find survivors of the villages Osric had destroyed and bring the truth to light. Your brother's medallion led me to your village." Elena's mind reeled with these revelations. "But why marry me? Why not simply tell me the truth from the beginning?" Bjorn's expression softened, something vulnerable flickering in his gray eyes. "When I reached your village and learned of your father's debt, I saw you being auctioned like cattle. Something in me couldn't bear it. Couldn't bear to see another innocent used as currency by powerful men." He looked down at his shackled hands. "I did not take you as wife out of obligation alone, though I had promised your dying brother I would ensure your safety if I could. Nor was it merely rebellion against my royal duties, though Freya would have you believe that." "Then why?" Elena pressed, needing to hear the words, needing certainty in these final hours. Because in that moment, standing in your village square, watching you hold your head high despite your circumstances, I saw something rare. Something worth protecting at any cost. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. I bought your freedom because I could. I didn't touch you because I refused to be one more man who took choice from you. The raw honesty in his words stripped away the last of Alina's defenses. The tears she had been fighting for days finally spilled freely down her cheeks. I was never meant to bring you into this danger, Bjorn continued, anguish evident in his voice. When Freya found us, I thought surrendering myself would protect you. I believed, foolishly, that even my uncle would honor the word of his daughter. Instead, he ordered my arrest as well, Elena said, understanding at last, to silence all witnesses to his corruption. Bjorn nodded grimly. The king fears exposure more than anything. With both of us executed for treason, there will be no one left to speak against Osric or reveal the truth behind the raids. A heavy silence fell between them as the full weight of their situation settled over them. They were pawns in a game far larger than themselves, a game where kings and commanders moved pieces with callous disregard for the lives affected. What happens now? Elena finally asked, though she already knew the answer. The dampness of the cell, the distant sounds of guards changing shifts, the increasingly meager rations, all pointed to a single, inescapable conclusion. Tomorrow at dawn, we face the king's justice in the courtyard, Bjorn replied, confirming her fears. A public execution to demonstrate the price of treason. Elena should have felt terror at these words, but strangely, a sense of calm had settled over her. Perhaps it was resignation, or perhaps it was the knowledge that she would face whatever came next beside this man who had risked everything to protect her, and others like her. I'm sorry, Elena, Bjorn said softly, genuine remorse in his voice. I meant to save you, not condemn you. Without thinking, Elena reached for his hand, her fingers twining with his despite the chains that bound his wrists. It was the first time she had initiated contact between them, the first time she had touched him by choice rather than necessity. You did save me, she whispered fiercely. Not from death, perhaps, but from living without knowing truth or dignity or... She hesitated, then found the courage to speak the word that had been growing in her heart. Or love. Bjorn's eyes widened slightly, surprise breaking through his stoic facade. His fingers tightened around hers, the chains forgotten between them. In another life, he began, but Elena shook her head, stopping his words. This life, she insisted, however short it may be. I would rather die tomorrow knowing what I know now, who you truly are, why you made the choices you did, than live 100 years in ignorance. Something shifted in Bjorn's expression then, the wall he had maintained for so long finally crumbling. With his free hand, he reached up to brush a tear from her cheek, his touch gentle despite the weight of the chains. I never thought to find honor in a dungeon, he said softly, or freedom in chains. Yet here now I am more myself than I have ever been. As night deepened around them, they sat together in their cold cell, hands intertwined, sharing warmth and whispered truths until exhaustion claimed them both. They slept side by side, shoulders touching, finding in each other's presence a comfort that transcended their dire circumstances. Dawn broke with the sound of approaching guards, their heavy footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Bjorn woke instantly, his warrior's instincts alert despite his weakened state. Elena stirred more slowly, her body stiff from the cold floor. The cell door swung open, revealing not just guards, but a royal procession. At its center stood King Harold himself, his crown gleaming in the torchlight, his face a mask of regal authority. Beside him stood Princess Freya, her expression unreadable. Bring them, the king commanded, his voice echoing against the stone walls. The guards hauled them roughly to their feet. As they were led from the cell, Bjorn caught Elena's eye one last time, a silent message passing between them. Whatever awaited them in the courtyard above, whether execution or some other fate, they would face it together. The morning light was blinding after days in the dungeon's gloom. Alina squinted against the brightness as they were marched across the frost-covered stones of the castle yard. A crowd had gathered, nobles and commoners alike, come to witness the king's justice. In the center of the yard stood a wooden platform. Bjorn was forced to his knees before it, his chains rattling against the frozen ground. Before the king could pronounce sentence, Bjorn raised his head, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "I ask only one thing, uncle." The king's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And what would that be, traitor?" Bjorn's gaze was steady, his voice clear despite his injuries. "Her freedom. The girl is innocent of any crime against the crown. She acted only under my command, out of fear for her life." Alina opened her mouth to protest, but Bjorn silenced her with a warning glance. He was offering himself as sacrifice, one last attempt to save her life. King Harold raised his hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to spread through the crowd. All eyes turned to the monarch, waiting for his decree. "Release the girl," he finally ordered, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Freya's face contorted with surprise and anger, but she quickly masked it behind a regal facade. The guards unlocked Alina's shackles, the iron falling away from her raw wrists. But as she stumbled forward, the king's next words froze her in place. "But him, take him north." The winter had descended with merciless intensity, blanketing the small fishing village in snow so deep that paths had to be cleared each morning just to move between the simple wooden dwellings. 4 months had passed since that fateful day in the castle courtyard. 4 months of uncertainty, of waiting, of a strange new freedom that felt more like exile. Alina sat at the rough-hewn table in her small cottage, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the parchment before her. Her fingers, no longer soft but hardened by months of work among the fishermen's wives, gripped the charcoal stick with practiced ease as she wrote words that would never be sent. Today, the sea froze another 3 feet outward. The old fishermen say they've never seen ice extend so far into the bay. "I wonder if you are colder where you are, in the northern territories. I wonder if you are alive to feel the cold at all." She paused, staring at the words. This was the 20th such letter she had written, each one carefully dated, each one containing her thoughts, her fears, her quiet hopes. Each one stored in a wooden box beneath her bed, waiting for a recipient who might never return to claim them. When the king had ordered Bjorn taken north, no one had explained what that meant. Execution, exile, imprisonment. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Alina had been escorted from the castle with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small purse of silver, compensation for her troubles, the royal steward had called it, as if coin could heal the wounds of the heart. She had chosen this remote fishing village deliberately, as far from the king's influence as she could manage without leaving the realm entirely. Here, among people who cared more about the day's catch than court politics, she had found a measure of peace. The widow who owned the village's only inn had taken her in initially, grateful for an extra pair of hands during the busy autumn season. By winter, Alina had earned enough to rent this tiny cottage of her own. The villagers asked few questions about the young woman with distant eyes who wrote letters each evening that were never sent. They respected her privacy, her quiet efficiency, her willingness to work alongside them mending nets and preserving fish. If they noticed the iron collar she had refused to remove, now hidden beneath a woolen scarf but still a physical reminder of her past, they were too polite to mention it. A sharp knock at the door startled Alina from her reverie. Visitors were rare in this weather, especially after sunset. Cautiously, she rose and crossed the small room, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she kept near the door, a habit born of hard experience. "Who's there?" she called, one hand on the latch, the other gripping the blade. "A message," came the reply, the voice unfamiliar and muffled by the howling wind. "From the north." Her heart stumbled in its rhythm, then raced ahead. From the north. After 4 months of silence, of wondering, of imagining the worst, a message. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the latch, pulling the heavy wooden door open against the force of the wind. The messenger was bundled in furs, his face nearly hidden beneath layers of wool and leather. Snow clung to his eyelashes and beard, giving him the appearance of a frost giant from old Norse tales. In his gloved hand, he held a small scroll sealed with wax. "Are you the woman called Elena?" he asked, his accent marking him as a northerner, one of the people from Bjorn's father's territories. "I am," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The man nodded once, satisfied, and extended the scroll. "I was instructed to deliver this directly to your hand, and to wait for a reply." Elena took the scroll, the parchment cold against her fingers. The seal bore no insignia, no mark of royal authority or noble house. Just plain red wax pressed with what appeared to be the pommel of a knife, a soldier's improvised seal. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to allow the messenger entry. "Warm yourself by the fire while I read this." The man nodded gratefully, stomping snow from his boots before entering her modest home. As he moved to the hearth, extending frost-numbed hands toward the flames, Elena broke the seal with trembling fingers. The message was brief, written in a strong hand with ink that had frozen and thawed several times during its journey. "The northern territories are harsh but fair. Exile ends with the spring thaw. The bearer of this message is trusted. If you have moved on with your life, send only your blessing. If not, he will guide you to the meeting place we discussed. He has promised to deliver what was promised to you." There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. Only one person would send such a cryptic message. Only one person would reference a meeting place they had discussed, though they had never actually spoken of any such location. It was a test, a safeguard to ensure she wasn't being manipulated. Exile ends with the spring thaw. The words echoed in her mind, their meaning slowly unfurling like a sail catching wind. Bjorn was alive. The North hadn't meant execution, but banishment to the territories his father had once ruled. And now, with winter's grip beginning to loosen, that exile was nearing its end. The messenger watched her carefully from his position by the fire, his shrewd eyes missing nothing of her reaction. "Do you have a response?" he asked after allowing her a moment to absorb the message. Elena hesitated, caution warring with hope. "How do I know this message is truly from him?" The man's weathered face creased in a half-smile. "He said you would ask that." Reaching into his tunic, he withdrew a small object and placed it on the table between them. "He said to show you this if you doubted." Elena's breath caught in her throat. There, on the rough wooden surface, lay a medallion, not her brother's, which now hung around her own neck beneath her dress, but another. This one bore the image of a wolf with a sword clutched in its jaws, the symbol of the Northern Territory's ruling family, Bjorn's family. "He also said," the messenger continued, his voice dropping to ensure his words wouldn't carry beyond the cottage walls, "to tell you that he never touched you until love became stronger than fear." The words, an echo of something she herself had whispered during their last days together, removed her final doubts. This man truly came from Bjorn. "When does he expect an answer?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I ride at first light," the messenger replied. "The journey north takes 7 days in good weather, longer if the thaw has begun in earnest." Elena nodded, her mind racing. To go north would mean leaving the sanctuary she had built for herself here, the modest independence, the quiet respect she had earned among the fishing community. It would mean venturing back into a world of nobility and politics that had nearly cost her life once before. But to stay meant never knowing what might have been, never discovering if the connection she had felt with Bjorn could grow into something more substantial than shared danger and whispered truths in a prison cell. "Tell him," she began, then paused, weighing her words carefully. "Tell him I will be at the meeting place when the ice breaks on the northern lake." The messenger nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "There is one more thing," he said, reaching once more into his tunic. "He asked me to deliver this, regardless of your decision." From within his clothing, the man produced a small iron key. Its purpose was immediately apparent to Elena. It would fit the lock of the collar she still wore around her neck. The collar Bjorn had placed there on their wedding day, the symbol of her status as a debt bride that she had refused to relinquish even after gaining her freedom. "He said you should choose for yourself whether to use it," the messenger added, placing the key beside the medallion on the table. "The choice must be yours alone." Tears pricked at Elina's eyes as her fingers closed around the small metal object. Such a simple thing, yet laden with meaning. The key to her past, and perhaps her future as well. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. The messenger departed as promised at dawn, carrying Elina's verbal response and a single sheet of parchment. The first letter she had actually sent from among the dozens she had written over the long months of separation. As winter gradually relinquished its grip on the land, Elina said her goodbyes to the fishing village that had sheltered her. The widow at the inn embraced her with surprising fierceness, pressing a small package of preserved fish into her hands for the journey. The old fisherman who had taught her to mend nets gifted her a fine bone needle of his own making. Small tokens from people who asked no questions but offered what kindness they could to the mysterious young woman who had lived briefly among them. When the day of departure finally arrived, Elina stood at the edge of the village, her few possessions packed, waiting for the guide Bjorn had promised would come. The morning mist hung heavy over the bay, obscuring the horizon where sea met sky. The air smelled of salt and melting ice and new beginnings. A sound of hoofbeats on the thawing earth drew her attention. A lone rider approached from the north road, his figure gradually taking shape through the swirling fog. As he drew closer, Elina's heart quickened its pace. There was something familiar in the set of his shoulders, the way he sat astride his mount. "I brought what I promised," the rider called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. The mist seemed to part then, revealing not a messenger or guide, but Bjorn himself. He dismounted with easy grace, though Elina could see he moved more carefully than before, evidence of injuries sustained during his northern exile. His face was leaner, weathered by harsh elements, and a new scar traced a thin line from temple to jaw. But his gray eyes remained the same, steady, intense, seeing through to her very core. Elina stood frozen, unable to move or speak as he approached. So many nights she had imagined this moment, rehearsed what she might say or do. Now, faced with the reality of his presence, words failed her entirely. Bjorn stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze taking in the changes in her as well, the new strength in her bearing, the quiet confidence she had developed during their months apart. "The northern elders granted me leave to return once I had proven myself worthy of my father's territories," he explained, his voice deeper than she remembered, roughened by the cold northern winds. "I am no longer exile or prince, but simply a man who has earned his place through his own actions." Elina found her voice at last. "And what place is that?" "That depends," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers, "on whether you still wear the iron collar beneath your scarf." Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, fingers brushing against the woolen fabric that concealed the band of metal she had refused to remove, despite possessing the key to its lock. "I do," she admitted softly. Something shifted in Bjorn's expression, hope kindling where there had been careful restraint. "Why?" he asked, the single word laden with meaning. "Because it reminded me," Elina answered, taking a step toward him, "that sometimes chains can lead to freedom. That sometimes what begins as transaction can transform into something true." The wind picked up around them, carrying the scent of thawing earth and new growth. Winter was truly ending, not just in the land, but in their hearts as well. Bjorn closed the remaining distance between them with measured steps, stopping just before her. With careful movements, he unwound the scarf from her neck, revealing the iron collar still circling her throat. His fingers brushed against her skin as he traced the metal band, sending warmth cascading through her despite the cool spring air. "May I?" he asked, producing another key, identical to the one she kept tucked within her dress. Elina nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her throat. The lock opened with a soft click. The collar fell away, landing in the mud at their feet. For the first time in more than a year, Elina's neck was bare, the pale skin marked with the memory of the iron that had encircled it for so long. "Now you are truly free," Bjorn said softly. "Free to choose your own path." Elina looked up at him, this man who had purchased her to save her, who had refused to claim her body until her heart was freely given, who had risked everything to protect not just her, but countless others from the corruption of powerful men. "I choose you," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the new scar that told its own story of survival and redemption. Not because of debt or duty or royal decree, but because in you I found something I never expected. "And what is that?" Bjorn asked, his hand covering hers where it rested against his cheek. "A man who saw me as more than my station, who chose to protect rather than possess." The wind swirled around them, carrying away the last vestiges of winter's chill. In the distance, a flock of geese returned from southern lands, their calls heralding the change of seasons. Elena raised her eyes to meet his, no longer separated by iron collars or social divides or royal machinations. For the first time since their paths had crossed, they touched not out of necessity or circumstance, but from choice, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that belied their strength, her body fitting against his as though returning to its rightful place. The snow at their feet continued to melt, erasing their footprints even as they stood together on the threshold of a new beginning. Elena lifted her face to his and whispered the truth that had sustained her through the long winter of waiting. "He did not touch me until love became stronger than fear." As Elena and Bjorn's story comes to a close, we're left to wonder, how often do we judge others based solely on appearances, on symbols and scars that tell only fragments of their true story? In a world that constantly tries to define us by our circumstances, our birth, our status, our past mistakes, their journey reminds us that true nobility lies not in bloodlines, but in choices made when everything is at stake. What would you do if faced with such impossible choices? Would you have the courage to see beyond the iron collar of your circumstances, to recognize that sometimes what begins as imprisonment can transform into the most profound freedom? Would you risk everything for a truth that might shatter your world, or for a love that defies every convention? If this story touched your heart, remember that like Bjorn and Elena, we all wear invisible collars of some kind. Expectations, fears, prejudices, waiting for the key that will set us free. Share this tale with someone who might need to hear that respect is love's truest form, and that destiny can turn even the darkest sentence into an unexpected blessing. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge the heart and mind, and leave your thoughts below on what you would have done in Elena's place.